I would just say, I make a final note about my how much I care about the left behind cities and how concerned I am about them and how much I believe that because that's really where the book started for me. It was just the feeling I get when I go to a Buffalo or Rochester, the feeling I get here living in Baltimore when I go down to DC just 40 miles away and then come back to Baltimore and I'm just stunned by the difference in prosperity. Um, and just how completely unhealthy that is and how much again for both sorts of places it's not good for a country to have that kind of disparity.
For more than a decade, Alec MacGillis has been chasing the story of wealth disparity in America. From Seattle's growing economy to a family in Dayton, Ohio struggling in poverty, MacGillis has looked into how tech giants are at the core of the issue. Recently, Investigative Post's J. Dale Shoemaker spoke with MacGillis about his research into Amazon and the roots of America's wealth divide.
You'd like to think that economics would sort of take care of that because as the winner take all cities get so damn expensive that people would somehow that things would kind of spread themselves out and correct themselves. But then you see Amazon go and put its second headquarters not in Buffalo and Rochester, not in St. Louis, not in Baltimore, but in the wealthiest city metro area in the country, which is Washington, D.C. So it's winner take all.
For Investigative Post, I'm Garrett Looker, and this is Newsmakers.
Well, Alec, welcome to Investigative Post's podcast.
Sure, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about your book, Fulfillment, America in the Shadow of Amazon. I've been reading through this. It is excellent. I really enjoy the people-focused nature of it. This is a really good piece of work. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and then zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit more broadly just about Amazon and particularly Amazon in Western New York. I think the first thing that I wanted to start off by asking you, just talk to us a little bit about how you got started on all of this. I mean, what was it about Amazon that caught your eye initially and you said, I need to maybe start researching a book on this?
Actually, the funny thing is that I started out with fulfillment not being about Amazon per se. I wanted to write a book about regional inequality in America, these growing gaps between cities in our country, not just the rural urban gap that you hear so much about, but the gap between cities, between sort of winner take all cities like Boston, New York, DC, Seattle, San Francisco, cities like that, and then the much larger group of sort of left behind cities and towns like Buffalo, like Rochester, like Baltimore, where I live, like cities in Ohio, where I've spent a lot of time as a reporter, like my hometown of Pittsfield, Mass, small city in Western Mass. There's been a just growing gap between those two sets of types of cities, and I've watched it happening over the years. I saw it happening growing up in Pittsfield, watching the gap growing between Pittsfield and Boston, watched it happening as a national political reporter for the Washington Post when I would go out in the sort of 2008, 2009 period around the country as a political reporter, go to places in Ohio, elsewhere in the Midwest, Appalachia, and then come back to DC and just be overwhelmed by the incredible prosperity and complacency on display in DC, while so much of the rest of the country was just really kind of in steep decline. And that gap bothered me so much. And I decided that I wanted to write a book about it, especially after Trump won the election in 2016. And that election, of course, had so much to do with these disparities and the resentment that they produced. And so I thought for about a year, how could I write a book that captures these disparities? What's the best way to kind of come at that issue, this regional inequality? And I finally settled on Amazon as the frame to tell that story for two reasons. One is that Amazon is just so ubiquitous in our life now that it's a handy kind of thread to take you around the country in a sort of metaphorical way, show you what we're becoming as a country. But then more importantly, Amazon and the other tech giants are themselves helping to drive this regional inequality. Because one of the reasons that we've ended up with such concentrations of wealth in certain places in our country is that we've ended up with an economy that's so concentrated in certain companies. So when you end up with retail money that used to be spread all around the country now being kind of sucked to Seattle, because that's where this massive giant that now controls so much of retail in America is based. And all that kind of commerce and prosperity that used to be spread all over the country is now increasingly drawn there. And it's happening in other sectors too. So that's how I settled on Amazon. It was really kind of a secondary, it was something that I arrived at as a way to tell the story that I really was after, which was these disparities, and then Amazon, which is a really good frame through which to tell that story.
Sure, sure. Just to kind of unpack that a little bit, you and I really like the way that you kind of go about this in the book. Let's take the example of, I think it's Dayton, Ohio, and in Seattle. Now you talk about, how Amazon has these really bougie offices in Seattle where you can, one of the first examples of a store where you can go in and just pick things off the shelf and you don't even have to pay for it because there's stuff monitoring you to charge your credit card later. And then the family in Ohio who is living in homeless shelters because they have no money, and I think is the husband of that family who's working in a cardboard box factory. Tell us a little bit more about, use that as, I guess, the frame to give us an example of what you mean by there are some cities that are winners and there are some cities that are losers.
Sure. I mean, the book really focuses on two winner places and two left behind places. The two winner places are Seattle and Washington, D.C., which I picked as my second winner take all place, even before Amazon picked it as its second headquarters. So that worked out very well. And then the two left behind places are Baltimore, where I live, and then various places in Ohio, including Dayton. And Dayton was just such a really kind of strong example of this dynamic, because it's a city that was back in the day really kind of the Silicon Valley of its time, a city that was just a font of incredible innovation, manufacturing innovation, in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And now it has fallen so far, so dramatically. And then I happened to find in some of my reporting out there this family that to me was just very emblematic of that sort of downward mobility of the entire city. A family who they actually were not married, two young people who had three kids together, and they were living in a homeless shelter when I met them in Dayton, despite the fact that the father, Todd, had a job working at a cardboard factory, making the cardboard boxes for the Amazon warehouses and other logistics places in town there. Dayton has now become, its manufacturing, its incredibly vigorous manufacturing economy there has been largely superseded by the logistics industry. The city now, because they've lost so many manufacturing jobs, they've had to fall back on all manner of logistics stuff, whether it's making cardboard boxes or trucking or packaging or warehouses. Because one of the things the city still has going for it is that it's very centrally located in the country. They've kind of had to fall back on that asset. Of course, those jobs make much less, pay much less, and are much less fulfilling than the manufacturing work that preceded it. So Todd is working as the book opens, he's working at this cardboard plant, making very little money, and for that reason, and because of other reasons of their life having become very dysfunctional in various ways, they end up at the homeless shelter there in Dayton. And then meanwhile, you have at the other end of the spectrum, a city like Seattle, where that prosperity that has resulted from that concentration of the economy and the concentration of wealth in certain places has become really excessive. That's the key thing to understand about these disparities. They're not just bad and unhealthy for the cities like Dayton, for the left behind places. They're also unhealthy for the winner take all cities like Seattle, where you have a city that used to be really very strikingly kind of middle class, kind of a very kind of accessible sort of city. I remember going there in around 2002 or 3 for the first time, just being struck by how much it still felt like a real city where you could feel what it used to be, sort of a natural resource town where the logs would come down and be shipped out from the port, real working rail yard, working port, still a really kind of a gritty city in its way. And now, of course, it's just become something completely different. The wealth of Amazon and Microsoft and others, but especially Amazon, has just completely transformed that place to the point where it's, of course, incredibly expensive now, almost Bay Area levels of housing costs. It's congested. It has really kind of lost so much of the character that made it an appealing place for generations. One aspect of that character that it's lost, which I focus on in the book, is the almost total erasure of the city's famous Black district, the Central District, which was this neighborhood really in the heart of the city that became in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, after the Great Migration to Seattle, became this incredible cultural hub with just all sorts of really kind of astonishing level of musical greatness that came out of there. Jimi Hendrix, Ernestine Anderson, Quincy Jones, and this wonderful, famous choir director that I focused that chapter on, who actually just passed a few months ago. And so I talk about the loss of that neighborhood as it's just been that wealth, that concentrated wealth, has just kind of overwhelmed it. And so really these disparities they're not good for either sort of place. We've ended up kind of completely out of whack by having this level of inequality between places.
Sure. Now, I want to, I guess, go a step deeper on, these winner-take-all cities and these left-behind cities. It seems fairly clear how the winner cities get the way they are. You have these large companies that have a presence there, whether that's Amazon in Seattle or Silicon Valley, all of the big tech firms down there. But for the left behind cities, how did they get that way? I mean, what happened to those places that they are in such stark contrast to these winter cities?
I would say it's sort of a two-step process. I mean, the first step of it is, of course, is deindustrialization. So you have just massive job loss that that resulted from decades of the sort of collapse of manufacturing in this country. So, for instance, in Baltimore, the other sort of left behind city that I focus on, there I tell the story of this amazing place just outside Baltimore called Sparrows Point, which was this peninsula that sticks out into the water just southeast of Baltimore, that was for much of the 20th century home to what was for a time the largest steelworks in the entire world. Bethlehem Steel had this huge plant there, huge mill that got up to around 30,000 jobs, an entire company town right there in the peninsula with 6, 7, 8,000 people living there, with a street grid and grocery stores and churches and movie theaters and the works, an entire company town to support the steelworks, a whole universe. And those jobs were incredibly grueling, incredibly dangerous often. But they paid after the unions finally came in, and one managed to unionize Bethlehem Steel in the 40s during the war. Those jobs became really quite well paid and somewhat safer. And for a lot of the men, mostly men who worked there, they were jobs that supported you for your entire life, supported you and your family for your life, and and held you there because they were well paying, because they were in their way quite satisfying. You were making stuff. You were such an integral part of sort of the physical American economy, and you also had this great sense of camaraderie with your coworkers that kept you there for years or decades. So Bethlehem Steel finally closed down in around, it was a very kind of excruciating slow death, but it basically sold. Bethlehem Steel itself went bankrupt in around 2001, and then it passed through various hands, the mill, before finally closing around 2012. And that was just gone. Like that, the mill was wiped clean off the face of the peninsula. The town had already previously been wiped away. So it's really eerie. You go there and it's just this massive expanse where they used to hold this entire huge skyline, industrial skyline, and it's just completely gone. What makes it especially eerie is you drive around and there's still your GPS. If you have GPS on, it still calls out the old street names of the streets that were there, but they're
Oh,
gone.
wow.
You're just driving on an open plain. And so that happened. And that's very, dramatic example of that deindustrialization. And there are all sorts of reasons for why that happened. And but then on top of that, so you have that collapse. But then on top of that, you have the second cause of this of the left behindness of this disparity is the concentration. The fact that we've gotten so lax about antitrust and monopoly in this country, that in all sorts of industries, other industries, beyond manufacturing, you've had this real concentration. So you have cities that, like Baltimore, like St. Louis, like Cleveland, like Milwaukee, all these cities that used to have, in addition to their manufacturing strength, used to have their own banking industry, their own real estate industry, their own insurance industry, their own advertising industry. And in all these various sectors, you've seen this concentration, corporate concentration, consolidation. And when that because we've gotten so lax about over the last few decades about are tending to antitrust concerns, because the government has just kind of been asleep at the switch on that front. So you end up with all these cities losing. So often when those concentrations happen, those consolidations happen, those cities, those sort of mid-sized cities, lose the headquarters. They end up with, they become a mere branch town, if that. And then on top of that, the other, sort of more general aspect of the corporate consolidation is what's happening in the tech industry. So, I already mentioned the retail example. Wealth, commerce that used to be spread all around the country, in mom and pop stores, in shopping malls, in department stores, in regional department store chains. My book focuses on a quite large regional department store chain in the Northeast and Midwest that was called the Bon-Ton. You may have, be familiar with it from it was in upstate New York too. And
I think we've all had grandmothers who were obsessed with the Bon-Ton.
Exactly. And it grew up, it came out of York, Pennsylvania, a small city in South Central Pennsylvania that started the Bon-Ton around like 1890, and it spread around the Northeast. And then finally, it just could not survive the e-commerce wave, the Amazon wave, and it went bankrupt a few years ago. And so all that kind of that other kind of commerce that used to sustain cities even after they maybe lost the steel mill, that so much of that is then gone, is now sort of sucked into Amazon. Or think about our industry. Think about the media. You used to have all that revenue, that media ad revenue that used to be spread all around the country in newspapers, TV, local radio, all these different realms. And now, as as ad revenue shifts to digital, that's where it's mostly at now. You have two companies that control more than 60% of all digital ad revenue, Google and Facebook. And where are they? They're in the Bay Area. So you end up with, picture all that wealth and all that revenue just kind of getting sucked and hoovered into the Bay Area, and you end up with the dystopian kind of wealth and inequality that you have there. So that's really, it's the two-part thing. It was deindustrialization, then coupled with corporate concentration.
Yeah. So, you were talking about Bethlehem Steel, and Buffalo was another home of a massive, Bethlehem Steel plant. Are Rust Belt towns, I guess, more likely to be these left behind cities? Were we kind of primed to, I guess, be in that left behind category?
Certainly, to some degree, yes. Some combination of the fact of so much of the so much of the manufacturing was there to begin with, because those are our older cities. Those are cities that grew up around that industry. And so when we started to lose manufacturing to other parts of the world, that's where you were going to feel the pain the most, in the cities that had the most of it to begin with. You also had of course, the dynamic of unions being stronger in the north, and so therefore, it wasn't just that you saw those jobs being lost overseas; they were also being lost to the south, to the non-union south, because labor was cheaper down there. While the left behind city dynamic is especially strong in the north for those reasons, there are plenty very left behind places elsewhere in the country as well. I mean, I think, for instance, of the devastation of Jackson, Mississippi, which has come to the fore just recently because of their water crisis there. But a city that, for similar but different dynamics, is in really, really dire straits now. Yeah, with not just the water debacle, but also just extraordinarily dramatic white flight and violence. Now that last year, they were by far had by far the highest homicide rate in the country. Just off the charts. You see the disparities all over the country. I certainly see them all over the country when I travel around. It's not just a northern issue.
Sure. And so you've touched on this a little bit, but what about those conditions open the door for Amazon? I mean, what is it about these quote unquote left behind cities that allows Amazon to come in and, well, I was just looking at my data earlier. We have, I think, 7 Amazon warehouses between here and Rochester. What is it about these types of places that is, I guess, welcoming to Amazon?
Well, it's, for starters, Amazon is now, in a way, kind of needs to be everywhere, because we as a country have, the American consumer has grown so extraordinarily reliant on Amazon and so expects, and so has come to expect really almost instant gratification of that one-click order, that Amazon really needs to be just about everywhere, close to any kind of sizable population center, to be able to fulfill that promise of a 1 or 2 day delivery. But what has then made certain communities especially vulnerable to Amazon's overtures to be actually subsidized to build those warehouses that it has to build everywhere is the desperation of the local leaders who have seen all this job loss, seen all this decline, and are so desperate for any kind of jobs they can bring in, any kind of quote growth to point to, that they fall victim to Amazon's demands for these subsidies. I mean, the subsidies that were just given out there for the Niagara County warehouse are incredible. I mean, they're so huge. I was really kind of stunned to see your story on that. $124 million from the county alone, plus much more from the state. Some of the largest subsidies in the entire country, just astonishing. And was just in this notion that it just boggles the mind every time, this notion that Amazon is able to persuade local officials that it would only come to the region if it gets these subsidies, when in fact it has to be there. Again, they have to be there. They can't, these are warehouses that they need to make deliveries from. It will do Amazon no good to build that warehouse in Ohio instead. They need to be in Western New York. And yet they're able to persuade local officials that the subsidies are necessary to their coming there. And it's really quite gobsmacking.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that was going to be my next question about the government assistance side of things. I was blown away by the little anecdote in the book about the U.S. communities bulk purchasing contract out of Prince William County. I've done some reporting on piggyback contracting in the past, so I'm a little bit familiar with kind of how that works. But the way that they were able to do that U.S. Communities contract that then got, 55,000 school districts around the country, just buying stuff on Amazon, not even necessarily a discounted price. Talk to me a little bit about the history of Amazon getting government money, whether from those school districts to the U.S. Communities contract or through the tax subsidies that we've seen here in Western New York that you just mentioned.
The tax avoidance is at the core of Amazon. It was at the core of Amazon going all the way back. Their whole advantage from the get-go, of course, was when they were just selling books, was that they could sell books without having to assess sales taxes, and therefore had right off the bat a 5 or 6 or 7% advantage over traditional brick and mortar booksellers. But they only had that advantage. The way the tax laws worked back then was that Amazon only had that advantage in a given state, not having to assess sales taxes if it was not physically present in the state. And then all those years since, for many years since, they actually avoided building warehouses in larger states because they didn't want to give up that sales tax advantage in those states. So they would deliver into Ohio from Kentucky, and didn't build any warehouses in Ohio until like 2014. It's only when they got to the point where they were so huge, so all in demand, that they kind of realized that they had to be everywhere. But at that point, the way they then managed to keep getting public tax breaks was through these prevailing on local communities to give them these incredible subsidies in order to build a warehouse there. So that's how they kind of made up for the fact that they were going to have to start actually assessing sales taxes in places. On top of that, as you mentioned, they've become very aggressive now in making money from the public sector by selling to the public sector. They have a whole division of the company now that is focused on getting government contracts. These are government contracts at the federal level. They're government contracts for the biggest ones are, of course, are for the cloud. They make the most profitable part of Amazon by far now is Amazon Web Services. They're these giant data centers through which so much of the tech economy is now being run. Netflix, Zoom, all these others, all of it's streaming through these data centers, and Amazon got some very big contracts from the federal government, from the CIA and others to handle that for the government. So they get that money from the taxpayer, but they've also now become very aggressive about doing more traditional procurement, just selling all the stuff that the government needs to buy. Amazon has made a big aggressive move to get that business, and then it's now percolated down to the local level, where they, as you mentioned, they've now become very aggressive about trying to get local school districts, local government to buy all their stuff from Amazon. We're talking about everything from pencils to paper to staplers to furniture, all of it, and
musical instruments. I think they
exactly,
mentioned.
Exactly, just everything you want. Amazon. It's the everything store. They can do it all, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it does feel like that there are more and more, just small towns around where at one point it may have been possible to, grow up there, raise, get a job somewhere locally, raise a family there, etc. But now, you can live there, sure, but you have to drive 20, 30, 40 miles to get to something, I guess, more economically viable. The other thing that it was striking to me was just the secrecy element of all of this. I mean, even in Western New York, whenever these Amazon projects first start, they're always called like Project Olive or Project X or something like that. And in the U.S. Communities contract, there was some element that they were advised against, filling FOIL requests, from local reporters. Just talk briefly about that. I'm just kind of curious, why that secrecy element is so important as, Amazon is spreading its tentacles.
Oh, it's incredible. I mean, it's such a huge sort of central animating aspect of their approach, and it's so especially ironic given that their founder, you know, bought the second or third most important newspaper in the country, the Washington Post, and to sort of save journalism and um, save the cause of sort of journalistic accountability and all that. Meanwhile, his company, his enormous company, is completely undermining transparency at every turn.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I mean the story behind the Niagara County warehouse here that they just recently approved is that they had originally wanted to put that on Grand Island, an island in the Niagara River, and there was some public opposition to that, and I was not able to, this is what my story that is preceding this conversation talked about a little bit, but there was never an official reason given for why they pulled out of Grand Island, but there was some speculation that the public outcry was part of it, that that was just beyond the pale and we needed to go next door. Yeah, so where does with all of the, I guess, the winner cities, loser cities stuff that we've talked about and some of the tax subsidy stuff, where does this leave a place like Western New York? I mean, like I mentioned earlier, we now have, I think, 6 or 7 Amazon warehouses between Buffalo and Rochester. What is the future hold for this region now that Amazon has such a big footprint here?
I mean, as far as Amazon goes, the sad fact is that we've ended up with just a kind of a sorting out of the country into different sorts of places, They're everywhere now, but they're everywhere in completely different sorts of ways. They manifest themselves in different ways. So you have the winter cities are now going to have the high-paying Amazon jobs. It's not just Seattle and Washington D.C., which got the second headquarters, but they're also now they're in Boston, they're in New York, they're in San Francisco, they're in LA. They've got thousands of white collar professional jobs paying $150,000 on average or higher in those places, and then the rest of the country gets to be the warehouse towns essentially, and it's not good. I mean, it's hard to see how that's going to change. Amazon and the other tech giants have gotten so huge and so dominant because we've been so incredibly slack about guarding against monopoly. We had this fight 100 years ago. We had this fight with Standard Oil and all the other giants of that era, and we decided that it was doing great damage to the country and to the economy, and we took on the fight in various ways, and then we let it slide in recent decades.
Sure. One of the things that I have found very striking is just the disparity in the amount of tax subsidies that Amazon ultimately gets. I mean, we have a perfect example right here in Western New York. We have a relatively small Amazon facility. I think it's maybe around 100 jobs. They got, I think, $7 million roughly in tax subsidies to build that particular facility. And then you go, not 10 miles away, not 20 miles away to Niagara County, and you have obviously a larger warehouse. This is like one of the 1,000 job warehouses, but they're getting far more than 10 times the amount of subsidies there. I guess this is kind of a two-part question. Part one, what drives that disparity on Amazon's part? I mean, are they really just looking to get the most that they possibly can out of every town, county, city? And part two is, what should our town supervisors and our mayors and our economic development officials be doing or saying to maybe level that playing field a little bit?
I think, my sense of it is that Amazon will just take as much as they can possibly get. I mean, they'll assess the level of desperation and they'll shoot for the moon. I mean, you saw it in the HQ2 fight as well, when they were, those 238 cities desperately applying to be home to the second headquarters, and yet they end up very predictably choosing Washington, Metro Washington and New York City, and and the subsidies that New York offered were way beyond those offered by Northern Virginia, and it really seemed simply as if New York had been that much more desperate, and had been really kind of just played for fools as a result, and that was then one reason why things blew up, because there was one reason for the big backlash in New York was that the subsidies were just so over the top there. And so really, I think they'll just they'll get as much as they can. It's pretty basic. And then for the local officials, I think it's just a matter of having more of that awareness of the fact that they need to be in a given region, that it's not that they need to be there. You're in a better bargaining position than you realize. And of course, that still leaves you with the problem of the terrible problem of sort of interregional rivalries, right? So one town or county competing against the other. And because even if they have to be in one part of Western New York, there's still the question of where they're going to be and which jurisdiction's going to get that quote growth. And in that regard, the best way to deal with that, of course, is, and this is like the great longstanding challenge of sort of local government and local economic development in this country, is just to be able to think more regionally.
Sure. As you, I guess, have been reporting on this, have you come across, economic development folks or public officials who have better ideas of doing economic development, particularly in this Amazon age?
Not really, I gotta say. What you are starting to see now more and more is local residents pushing back at some of these deals when they catch wind of them. There was some resistance recently to a warehouse in outside Pittsburgh. There's more and more resistance in the Lehigh Valley area of Pennsylvania, Eastern Pennsylvania, which has really become kind of ground zero for the warehouse logistics industry on the East Coast, kind of the counterpart to the Inland Empire outside LA, which is just completely taken over by warehouses. And so you're seeing kind of a more sort of citizen-led pushback in a lot of places. But for economic development folks, it's still so easy to point to that warehouse simply as growth, as new jobs. And there's just I really haven't seen, and the economic development folks who can afford to sort of to not play that game are the ones in the winter places who are getting to do getting all the better sort of jobs, and so they don't even have to. But Amazon's not even going to come knocking with that, because they know it's pointless. But for all the places, the left behind places, no, I've not seen someone saying, you know what, we can do better than this. We're going to do this instead. I'm sure they're out there, but I'm not aware of them. And then finally, I have been urging people to, regular people, to be more mindful of all of this from the consumer standpoint as well, and to think about where that money is going when you're making that purchase from Amazon instead of from a local store, even if you're buying it from, I'm no great fan of like the strip mall, the shopping mall, the big box. My God, they have had their own real sort of deleterious effect on the American landscape. But even when you're buying it from them, more of that money is staying local, and you're also having the benefit, at least, of some kind of social interaction with people in your community when you're sort of you're carrying out your role as a consumer that way. There's some interaction with the cashier, with the person stocking the shelves. I think one reason that our society has become so incredibly atomized, so isolated, such incredible levels of loneliness and all the rest, is that we don't even have those passing encounters anymore, partly as a result of the growth of e-commerce. When that box lands on the front step or on the porch, you're barely even often going to look up to acknowledge the guy who brought it, right? And there's just no interaction at all anymore between your wish for something and the fulfillment of that wish. It's these places that make our city special are at real risk of shriveling away. And it's because we've just turned so inward, hunkered down so much, and have just really kind of gotten used to that kind of living. And I really believe it's terrible for our towns and cities.